Welcome to the Springs in the Desert podcast. We're those friends that you can take with you wherever you are on the path of infertility. Hey there, Springs in the Desert. I am Jillian, your host, and I have Christina Heidemann, our show note writer and a contributor for Springs in the Desert with me here today. How are you doing, Christina?
Good, Jillian. Thanks.
Yes, it is so good to be with you. And we have a special guest today. We have Jamie Rathjen from the Fiat Institute. It is so good to have you. How are you today, Jamie?
Hey, Jillian, I am super excited to be on the show with you today. So I'm doing great.
Awesome. We are all so excited. I just want to tell you all a little bit about Jamie. Which I love this, Fiat, or let it be, from Luke 138 is Jamie's life verse and inspiration, which I need to perhaps pray a little bit more about. I love that. And she uses this verse for her work in the area of women's health and wholeness. Jamie is a fertility care practitioner and the founder and owner of the Fiat Institute, which is an entity that trains hormone coaches. And we're going to talk about that today. And she's also a co-host of the Hormone Genius podcast. So we'll give a plug for that at the end. But if you're not listening to that, you should go and pause and hit follow and subscribe to them. And then we'll have more conversations about that. Jamie holds a master's degree in community health education, where she studied the effectiveness and use of fertility awareness-based methods and their exclusion for most medical settings, which we talk a lot about here at Springs in the Desert. Jamie and her husband and 4 children reside in Cedar Falls, Iowa. And it is so great to have you with us today. I just want to begin opening this conversation with, your personal story about the Fiat Institute. Our guests really relate to that. So Jamie, if you would just share a little bit about where the Fiat Institute began and a little bit about your prayer and discernment with that.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. Yes. Ever since I was young, I would be so just amazed by people, by their interests, by their uniqueness, right? And when I was young, I would always just wonder, Lord, what are you calling me to do? What is it, God? And I would obsess kind of about it. What is your will for me? And it wouldn't leave me alone, like that thought. And so even growing up, cradle Catholic, pro-life family, and I just felt so, again, convicted to follow God's will, no matter what. I didn't know where my natural inclinations necessarily were. Some people are great with numbers. I can't say that I am. Some people are really artistic and I draw terribly. And I just couldn't quite get there. As I was going through high school and college, really what helped me understand what God was calling me to, he's calling us to his will every day. And of course, those things can adjust and change. But when I was in college, I was a collegiate athlete. So I ran track. And, a Division I sport is very intense. And it becomes like your job and your focus. And it was hard for me to think about anything else. So it was almost like a distraction for me. So it was distracting me from that prodding, even when I was young, But it all went crashing down, that obsession, when I got injured and I couldn't run. And it was my senior year and I was forced to think about what is my next step. I didn't know. And so with that injury came another year of school. And I decided, okay, I'm going to get my master's degree in community health education while I do my last year of track. Okay. I was never as fast. I was never as abled to run as well like I was before, because it's almost like a false god. I loved it so much. I was obsessed. So that 5th year of college really, again, forced me, and really my 5th year, but my first year as a master's student, I had to think about, again, what was God calling me to? I had to think about this. I couldn't escape from it anymore. I couldn't, quote unquote, run from it anymore, right? Can't not say that part when I share this story. So anyway, my husband and I were engaged to be married, and we were trying to figure out, what are we going to do for our family planning? Okay. We hadn't had sex. We were waiting for our wedding night. And, I wanted to learn everything I could about naturally avoiding pregnancy without birth control. And just having come up, grown up in a family where my mother would share about her experiences on birth control. She had always terrible headaches. And I just never really wanted to do that from just the stories I heard. So I thought, okay, I'm going to study in this community health education master's. I'm going to really dig into fertility awareness systems just for my own marriage. I thought that's going to be my master's research topic. You have to do the thesis paper, get IRB approval, do a research topic. Like, I'm going to ask doctors and nurses, like, what they know, what they don't know, what they learned in med school about this topic. But really, for me, it was like, I'm going to just like cross it off my list because I really wanted to go on to further schooling to be like a PA or an occupational therapist. This was just a middle point, you know, to satisfy that track injury. I had an extra year. While I was going through this process, the Lord showed up in ways like it's like he was knocking like truly on my heart. He was like, open up, Jamie, like your life's going to change. And as I started discovering the truths about how my body works, I couldn't stop thinking about that, you know? And what started off as a mild curiosity turned into a full-fledged passion. With that passion, I got my fertility care practitioner, you know, certificate because, again, I wanted to help women not just understand their times of fertility or infertility, but I was really interested in this concept that doctors don't learn about this in med school, and how can we make it more like approachable by those who value medicine, you know, like it's actual valid. It's not just a quote unquote Catholic church thing. It's a women's health thing. I wanted people to take it seriously. So anyway, my story is, you know, a bit long, and feel free to interject at any point here. But as I was going through that training as a fertility care practitioner, everything kind of came into full focus when I was wrestling around with the idea of the name I would call my fertility care center. And I thought, what am I going to call this center? And I couldn't stop thinking about it. And one night, as I was drifting off to sleep, again, wrestling with it all day, Fiat came to mind. And it was a whisper. I didn't know what Fiat even meant because at this point I'm like 24 or something, and my faith mattered, but I hadn't dug in really too much personally. So I didn't even know what Fiat meant. But I thought, wow, Fiat Fertility Care Center sounds really good, actually.
Yes.
Right? Doesn't that sound great? I'm like, Lord, I've never had this happen. You literally answered my prayer as I was drifting off to sleep.
Love that.
Thank you. Wish that happened more often, you know?
Yeah.
So I thought, that's the name. Okay, Fiat Fertility Care Center. Didn't know what the word was, which again was interesting. The next morning I looked it up. And at this point, again, I'm really discerning, you know, is this something I'm supposed to devote my whole life to? And when I learned what Fiat meant, so Fiat is Mary's response to the angel Gabriel when he invites her to be the mother of Christ. She says, Fiat voluntas tua, which means let it be done to me according to thy word. Like, according to angel, what you're saying to me, I will follow God's will. And she said, yes. So in that moment, I realized God was calling me personally to say fiat to his will, which I was so obsessed with following when I was young. And then it spurred in me when I started learning about my own body, like the wonders of our womanhood. And it didn't end there in terms of this experience. When I was kind of learning what that word was, I sensed that he was inviting me to say yes, like he was inviting me to say yes to his will for my life. But I got the sense that what that was for me to teach women how to say fiat. So it started a whole thing in my life. And ever since, truly, like, so as a fertility care practitioner, I started working with a doctor whose doctor's office was called Name A. That's not the name of the center, but it wasn't, you know, it was called the Name. When he started working with me, he changed his whole center name to Fiat Family Medicine. He's a doctor with nurses and staff. Stopped prescribing, got trained as an APRO, changed his whole practice name to Fiat Family Medicine. And then from there, we started a women's healthcare center in the space called Guiding Star Cedar Valley, from the Guiding Star Project, if you've ever heard of it. And then from there, I started Fiat Institute from the need that I saw in this 15 years. Like, Fiat Institute, I believe, is like filling the gaps in what we need to know about our health, because it's not just about avoiding and achieving and about major medical conditions. There are things like lifestyle things we can do for our health to make a difference in terms of our hormones.
Wow.
So there we have it. There we have it.
That is an incredible story. There's so much that struck me. And I think a couple things that we talk a lot about as Springs in the Desert is, one, that this was really a fruit of your marriage. You know, that although this was something that God placed on your heart, that it was in your discernment and trying to figure out what is best for your family that this desire, really grew. And, I think for those in the Springs in the Desert community who are struggling with infertility, I think that they'll find that encouraging, that there is so many ways that we can give life that is a fruit of our marriage through just, this discernment of what does our family look like. And it might not look the way that we hoped, right now, but the Lord still has plans for us. He still has desires, big plans. And, another thing that I really love about Fiat is that it's a response. It's not, Mary didn't come out and just say, okay, I'm going to do this today. She received this request and had a freedom to say yes or no. And so I just love that, that the Fiat Institute has this posture of receptivity, has this, the beginning is a response to what the Lord is already speaking to us. Oh gosh, I love that story. It's so beautiful.
My favorite part is that when you heard God's voice, what he wanted you to call it, or the name, kind of reminded me of Saint Bernadette, when Mary told her, I'm the Immaculate Conception. She had no idea what that meant.
Yeah.
And you didn't either,
Yeah, that's so true. What was interesting too about that night was I was in my head thinking, Fiat? Like what? And
like the car?
Right, yeah, and I'm like, that what? And it kept repeating, Fiat, Fiat, Fiat. Like it wasn't just like one word, it was on repeat. And I'm like, okay, this is it. Like I know it. Did I imagine it? No, it was on a repeat, But yeah, that's a beautiful connection with Saint Bernadette. And she was actually my confirmation saint.
Oh, wow. That's awesome. Wow. What an intercessor.
Yeah,
and
totally.
Yeah, I would say too, I pray often at night, and sometimes I get a little discouraged because I'll fall asleep in the middle of my prayer. But I love hearing stories like what you just shared, because it's like Saint Joseph. God spoke to Saint Joseph in his sleep, that his communication has no limitations. And so I love that. And I want to learn a little bit more about the Fiat Institute. Now we know the fruit of this. Can you tell us a little bit more about what the Fiat Institute does, and how, as we know, just in my looking through it and hearing all about it, how it draws us back to Christ with a focus on, like you said, our bodies as a whole. Hey friends, it is your podcast host, Jillian, just popping into this episode to ask you to consider supporting our podcast with a financial gift. This episode is brought to you by staff, volunteers who reviewed the content, and a professional editor. We would be so grateful for your financial support to keep this podcast sounding great and reaching more listeners who need a friend on the path of infertility. Thank you for your support.
Yeah, and I was going to ask one more question. How is it also different than for women who are already meeting with, a NAPRO teacher or a Creighton charter? How is it different?
I love those questions. Yes. So Fiat Institute, again, was born from a need that I saw in the space of in my case, I'm a Catholic woman. Of course, any woman can practice these natural systems, but I've been in fertility care, and I've gone through like the FEM training, the symptothermal training, just through my research as a graduate student, interviewing doctors and nurses, and being in this world, even in women's healthcare, directing a healthcare center. I just saw like what was missing. And the part I believed was missing was we focus a lot again on fertility and infertility. What are how do we understand when is a great time to have intercourse, when to avoid intercourse, depending on your goals. And if there's a health problem, we send them off to the doctor. And then the doctor, which they're so wonderful, and NAPRO, and again, FEM medical management and Marquette, wonderful. But what about the women who get sent off to the doctor and they don't have endometriosis and they don't have PCOS? Is the only answer in those cases medication, like an antidepressant or metformin or whatever? Where does a lifestyle and education beyond sex hormones come in? What amount of power can we have in regards to our hormones? And so that's what I started brainstorming and dreaming about is, what if we can educate women more on just the chart? It's kind of like this idea of, as women, we talk about the feminine genius, right? And Jillian, you said at that moment, Mary was receptive to the news, right, of the angel. And with my hormone coaches, when I train them in Fiat womanhood. And I call it the Fiat coaching methodology. I train women, and it's a practice, of course. I mean, we're always practicing together, but how do we activate our feminine genius to really serve that woman? And so when we think about the world, we think about the feminine in ways, right? And we think about the masculine. And when we think about the feminine, we think about, especially feminine genius, we think about nurturing, receptivity, generosity, sensitivity, maternity, those sorts of things. But when I started thinking about the natural charting systems, which are essential for the world, like super important. I'm definitely not saying that those aren't great. They're wonderful, but they're just part of the story, and they're a bit masculine, and that there's data and we follow a regimen and this and that. But what I struggled with as a fertility awareness instructor myself was that there wasn't room for me to exercise my feminine genius or feel that person, receive that person, and it had to be very standardized. Now, obviously, I understand standardization for gaining, obviously like research and data, and it's very important. But I think it's just as important to exercise the feminine genius when we're sitting in that space with women, especially those who've experienced loss, frustration with infertility, miscarriage. To answer your question is, I feel like this is kind of filling the gaps, and we're viewing that woman as a whole, and we're seeing the woman beyond the chart. Who's the woman behind that chart? Because again, we get into that pattern of just looking at that data, just what do the stickers say? But what's that woman? What's that woman experiencing? So it's more alive, I would say, in terms of how I experience it. I hope that answers your question.
And I was just going to say, people that don't do this, when she says stickers, that's part of the Creighton model, is you use these little red, green, yellow. So that was what that meant.
Yes. Or like tracking on the app. Like even tracking symptoms, that's important. Like we do need a balance of masculine and energy. Complementarity is very important. But I do think that that's the Fiat Institute. I think, God has called me to that, I believe, because we need to balance it, as we care for women. And I would say the majority of clients are women who are already charting using a system, but they still don't understand why their periods are so heavy, why they have mood swings, why their cycles are irregular, because they don't have a quote unquote diagnosis.
So you meet and you review the chart, but then you also do some other things, is what it sounds like.
Well, for me personally, I train women to be hormone coaches. So Jamie, like myself, I meet with women to do both, because I'm trained in both, but I train women to do the hormone coaching aspect because 60% of women are on birth control for either a joint reason of birth control and health reasons, or just for health reasons alone. So there's health elements that woman's on the birth control pill for. And so again, as I was building this, that was kind of like my target group. I thought that's who I'm reaching out to. I'm not teaching people to avoid pregnancy naturally, but we are working with women who are having difficulty achieving pregnancy, especially if there's not a known diagnosis, or if there is, but it takes lifestyle to maybe address those. So it's more of like a hormone health coaching through the lens of Fiat womanhood.
Wow. I'm really struck by this idea of the masculine part of charting and this kind of feminine need of maybe, like you said, I love this beyond the chart, going a bit beyond that. And yeah, I think perhaps that is why, we hear from people in the community. I've experienced it myself. It's perhaps why there's some fatigue in charting, that it's not quite meeting the needs of the couple. It's certainly, as you said, I know with our charting, I don't have endometriosis, I don't have PCOS. It felt like there was no answer for any of the problems we were experiencing. And my chart was helpful to be able to say, yeah, okay, we can kind of exclude X, Y, and Z, or let's look into A, B, and C, because your chart sort of looks like there might be something there. But it didn't really, I wanted to have conversations, and I wanted to ask why, and I wanted to dig a little bit deeper, and the chart is limited. It is, I learned so much and observed, what are the things my body is doing, but it doesn't always answer those why questions, or those, open up, if my husband and I are looking at the chart, we're kind of just looking at it. We don't always know, unless we are, really researching, trying to figure out, what does this mean, or why might that happen? There is some limitations. And so I appreciate this idea of going beyond the chart and diving a little deeper. I'm wondering, I think this would be a good transition to move into, this fatigue that I was talking about, if and not necessarily specifically with charting, but just with any sort of focus on our body, I think it can be overwhelming. I know I felt sometimes where I'm trying to discern, do we take a break from this treatment, or do we, this diet feels very overwhelming or expensive, or I'm hungry all the time and this doesn't feel right. And so, yeah, I'm wondering if you, Jamie, would be willing to kind of speak into what kind of advice, or what could we say to a woman who is feeling overwhelmed or tired from an intense focus on her body, and how can we kind of reclaim that?
Yeah, totally. As you were sharing a little earlier, we were talking about like that balance and our body. So in so many ways, this analogy works really well, I think. But when our body is not in balance, so I'm definitely going to answer your question, but I'm going to kind of like go around the corner and answer it. Hormones keep our body in balance, like on the most high level, fundamental level, like it keeps our body in homeostasis. So if there's a hormone that's off, other hormones are going to readjust. And it's like this hormone symphony hormonally. So we're talking beyond just like sex hormones, estrogen, testosterone, progesterone. We're talking cortisol and our hunger hormones and our thyroid hormones and all these. Okay, so it's important to stay balanced. And when we're not, our body tells us when we're not in balance. Now, when I think about balance, and then we bring that over to like, that wholeness we want to experience as a woman. God calls us to be a woman this day and age. Being a woman is a gift. But sometimes those pressures or those expectations or those stressors that are put on us. So for instance, in this case, the hope for a pregnancy, the frustration that it's not happening, it's creating an imbalance in our wellness. And I like to think about, it's such a good book, Rediscovering the Feminine Genius by Catherine Zeno. I know the author's name is correct. I always get confused with the first name, like first word. Reclaiming the Genius, something like that. But she talks about root, shoot, fruit. And I love that. And as hormone coaches, we actually think through that as we're working with women. Because so when again, we're getting this stress or this anxiety, just like our hormones give us clues through their symptoms that something is off, this is like that unease or that anxiety is a symptom of imbalance. But now when we think about imbalance, it's beyond just the physical imbalance. Now we're like getting into the spiritual imbalance and the emotional and the mental imbalance. So root, shoot, fruit, the way Catherine Zeno explains it, root, of course, is our rootedness in Christ. So she's identifying our identity as women. So root is our identity as daughter of Christ. And that is the first and most important part of our identity is in Christ. And if we're not rooted in Christ, then our vocation as a woman, which would be the shoot, so the shoot is like growth of the foliage above the soil, that will be weak. If we don't have a strong root system, the shoot will be weak. And of course, if our shoot, which is our vocation as women, is weak, we will not be able to produce good fruit. So in these cases where a woman's stressing out and being and very nervous, anxious, angry, I think to myself, okay, how is that affecting her shoot? How is that affecting her fruit? So maybe it's at work, fruit in her marriage, fruit in other ways of her feminine genius. How is she receiving her friends? How is she putting herself out to the world? It's okay if we can't produce fruit. Then we go back and we think, let's work on the shoot, the vocation. Well, let's say we're struggling with our vocation as a woman, as a hopeful mother. Then we go to the root and we spend our time there. We water that seed. We take care of the root system, and we spend our time there until that there is peace there. And then we start working our way up. That's how I think of it.
Beautiful. Because a lot of times we're focused on the fruit, right? And we're just trying to fix that. We don't dig.
Yep.
Fix the roots.
And we're getting frustrated because we're like, we think, this is never going to happen. And again, it could be the hopelessness that we feel, but even just in ways that it affects our life. Like we think about concentric circles. So how we view ourselves in our own experience doesn't just affect us, but it affects our relationships. It affects our community. It affects our dreams and our hopes, like our impact. We ourselves, it's not just us, And so that's why, again, when and I'm literally just speaking from my own personal experience, like when I start getting like that, I'm like, okay, addicted. like power down. I'm going to focus in on the root because clearly these are symptoms that I'm not quite right in that space.
Wow. I've just never thought of it that way. And I love that Catherine lays out, that she lays it out that way. I mean, one, it's clever, very clever. But also, as you said, there's so many ways that analogy is just speaking and growing in my mind right now. I just think, if we don't know, if we're having troubles with our identity and who we are, we're going to have troubles with what we were made to do and what we're capable of and how we see ourselves. And I love this, how you just said sort of like to diagnose, or it's a symptom, that I don't think I give myself the time to sort of diagnose what's happening emotionally or spiritually. I only think of that in physical terms, oh, I have this physical symptom, this is what's going on. But to say, I'm feeling this way, this must be a symptom of X, or, I realize I am responding this way because I'm struggling with something that happened earlier that day, or something I'm trying to discern through. And so I am really grateful that you shared that, and I am absolutely we're gonna link to that book in the show notes because I'm gonna go buy it. And I feel like everyone should, because that sounds incredible.
It's awesome. I reference it all the time. I probably need to email her and see if I can just so you know, can I interview you someday? Yeah, it's great.
Oh gosh. Well, Jamie, before we close here, I just want to thank you so much for what you're doing at the Fiat Institute, and as you said, filling the gap. It's clearly needed, and so to be serving in that gap is exactly where the Lord desires for you to be. And for those in our community who would like to get in touch with you or to learn more, where could they find you at?
Visiting my website at fiatinstitute.com. You can learn more about the Hormone Coach training program. And then if you're looking for a hormone coach who is trained, obviously, then you can go to fiatinstitute.com/directory.
Awesome.
And then you'll be able to see those who've been certified to get connected.
That's super helpful. We'll definitely also link that in the show notes so people can easily find you and find a hormone coach if that's the step that they're on right now in their discernment. Well, Jamie and Christina, thank you so much for this conversation. I am going to be praying with this for a long time to come. Yeah, listeners, I just want to encourage you that wherever you are on the path of infertility, that we are here walking with you. And if you are needing a little bit of a break, or you're feeling fatigued by a focus on your body, I pray that this conversation is helpful to give you some reprieve and some encouragement to do whatever it is that the Lord is asking you to do. It is an honor to walk with you, and we will see you next time. Thank you so much for joining us for this Springs in the Desert podcast episode. We would be so grateful if you took a minute to rate and review us so that we can reach more listeners. Don't forget to check out our social media pages on Facebook and Instagram, and go to our website, springsinthedesert.org, where you can sign up for our newsletter and community prayer list, read our blog, and register for virtual and in-person events. Most importantly, remember that God loves you so much, and so do we.